Hi there again, and welcome to another part of The Plain Truth. Joining me again is the awesome Captain Al. Hi, Captain Al.
Hi, Matt. How are things?
Oh, do you know? It's pretty much like it was last time we did this. It has to be said. So it's hot and muggy and very unpleasant. But there we go. Listen, Al. While I've got you, I wondered if I could just have a quick chat to you about. Well, the dreaded word bird strikes, really. So, I mean, as a nervous passenger, we all know I'm a nervous passenger, because I went and saw the film Sully. Brilliant film, really enjoyed it, really interesting. But obviously that's been playing in the back of my mind. I mean, obviously what happened to Sully was a very extreme example of that, especially to lose all engines, essentially. In general terms, if there is a bird strike, what usually happens as far as the aircraft is concerned?
Okay, well, officially, bird strikes are known as wildlife strikes because there are other species of animal that we end up having a adverse interface with.
Right. Okay. It's those flying pigs again, isn't it? That's...
Well, yeah, I don't have one of those on my list. Okay. But things like rabbits and foxes are quite often around airports. Obviously, they're not in the air, but you can hit rabbits and foxes on takeoff and landing. We'll talk a little bit about that shortly. So with regards to Sully, a couple of things. First of all, everybody survived. No serious injuries. Yes. So let's focus on that bit, okay? And then also, how often do these kind of events happen? Once in a lifetime, maybe.
Right.
So we're not talking about frequent events. So whenever we have infrequent events, they always become dramatic events if there's a story to be had. Undoubtedly, there will be a statistic that someone can come up with to say, what is the chance of having two geese or more geese go down both engines on a modern transport aircraft and causing the terminal destruction of those engines? There will be a statistic. I'll just round it up and say it's a pretty rare event. Right. So, how rare is it to hit wildlife? Well, that's fairly common, actually. But if we just talk about things that are in the air initially, what do we tend to see as normal human beings walking around planet Earth in the air of an animal variety most frequently? What sort of birds do you see?
So, I mean, it's sort of things like swallows and seagulls and sort of that sort of thing.
Okay, so relatively small birds. Yes, seagulls can get quite big, but relatively small birds. So if we think about starlings, thrushes, robins, they're all pretty small. So if you hit one or several of them, they don't do a lot of damage. If we get up to pigeon and seagull size, then they can do a little bit more damage. And obviously when we get up to goose, swan, vulture type size, then obviously they can be quite damaging. Generally speaking, larger birds stay away from airliners. The smaller birds tend to be in flocks. And I know geese fly around in flocks before anybody writes in, phones in, etc., etc. But the smaller birds tend to flock a lot. And when we hit them, as unfortunately we do from time to time, it's bad news for them, but not bad news for us. The little birds, unless they hit one of the critical areas, so like one of the probes for airspeed, temperature, etc., will leave, I don't want to get too gory, a little red splat mark, and that is all that is left. The bigger birds, they can leave a bigger splat mark, and we have to make sure that they've not sort of impaled their body on bits like the undercarriage or the flaps where bones and flesh can get in the mechanism of the aircraft and cause some problems. If a bird the size of a pigeon goes down an engine in flight, you remember from a couple of shows ago we talked about the fan at the front of the aircraft. That is just a big fan. So if you were to throw a pigeon into the front of that, centrifugal force will force any object to the outside of that fan, and basically the bird or the debris will go within the engine but through the outer duct, basically through it, and it's called the bypass duct, and that's actually where most of the thrust comes from. That fan at the front, if you consider it to be a very sophisticated propeller, that's where most of the thrust comes from. About 80% of the thrust just comes from that big fan. So the debris just goes down kind of like, it goes within the engine, but in the outer part of the engine where there's just a void, and it just shoots out the back of it. So with regards to big birds like geese and vultures, yes, they can do damage, and there are things that we can do to avoid hitting them. So one of the things that we do is we have our landing lights on, and the animal psychologists tell us that we look like a very, very large eagle when we do that. So birds get a little bit scared when they see large predatory birds, so we'll fly away. Birds also tend to be quite good at avoiding us. We generally don't try to avoid them. It's not safe to do that, but they generally avoid us. So yes, wildlife strikes do happen. I've talked a lot about birds. On the ground, we can hit things like rabbits, foxes. I've had a fox strike on takeoff before now. It is perfectly conceivable to, and it has happened, to hit things like badgers, and even quite large animals. So I'm reminded of the fact of about, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago at Manchester Airport in the UK, an aircraft hit a cow on landing. So a cow had strayed out from adjacent field and onto the runway. It killed the cow. There was no real damage to the aircraft. They went around and landed safely afterwards. So wildlife strikes are fairly common, especially at migratory times of year, so spring and autumn, and also in areas where you get, for example, seagulls, so any sort of coastal airfield. And one of the things that we stopped doing in aviation quite a long time ago is having rubbish dumps near airports, because then obviously that is a absolute magnet for birds and vermin and so forth. So we try to avoid having those sort of things. So in a nutshell, wildlife strikes, yes, they can cause some damage. More often than not, it's minor and is just some paperwork to be filled out. The authorities tend to like you to bag up anything that you kill and send it to them so that they can analyze it. Most pilots will say, okay, I didn't find anything really to send back in the bag. But if we do, we bag it up and send it to them so they can try to analyze what species it is and see if they can come up with ways to mitigate big migratory areas and so forth. So that's about it, really. Again, I'm afraid to say it's one of those things, it happens from time to time, not particularly exciting.
And presumably, I mean, the issue that we're aware of, obviously, to do with the Sully thing. I mean, presumably your biggest risk, certainly in terms of I'll stick with the term bird strikes because it's animals in flight I'm referring to.
Yeah, we hit bats from time to time. So I've not actually seen any pigs, but no. Yeah, bats.
Anything's possible in these strange times. But presumably the risk, obviously, when you're in cruising altitude, presumably there's very little up there to sort of get in your way.
High altitudes, it is very, very rare to see wildlife, birds. I don't have any data, but I know that geese can occasionally fly above 20,000 feet.
Oh, wow.
So it's not out of the question. I can safely say that I've never seen any animals above sort of 20,000 feet, apart from occasionally the really badly behaved passengers.
Quite lovely. And on that bombshell, I think that's a great place to end. Thank you, Captain Al.
My pleasure.